In the whipping, I'm whipping the soul out it. Chin the tone when I'm flexing like Pilates. Why you frontin', you act like you somebody. Keep a trail in the ville, how I go by it. I was stuck in the rut, I was nobody. I've been looking for something to go body. There's an art to the hustle like yo got it. Kid got a kick back and here like a new shotty. In the whipping, I'm whipping the soul out it. Chin the tone when I'm...
Yo, before we start the video, I would just like to say that I have a Discord. It will be the link in the description. That's all. Yo, what is going on, Titan Clan? It is your boy King Titan X here, back with another video. And this video we're basically going to be covering what if Deku was Tatsumaki's little brother. Izuku in this canon would have actually been around 3 years younger than Tatsumaki. And another thing that I did not mention in the beginning though is the fact that Fubuki will also be in this series. Fubuki will be the youngest sibling, being 5 years younger than Tatsumaki, and she would have also been 2 years younger than Izuku. Of course, when it comes on to Tatsumaki, she would have also been aged down here. She will be 19. She will basically be 19 here. And that's pretty much how it will go. That's pretty much how the beginning of everything will go, just setting up the timeline. So, Izuku would have been the middle sibling. The thing about Tatsumaki is that she was a powerful Esper, and because of her powerful abilities, she was also a bit of an overprotective sister, if you get what I mean. Izuku, unlike Tatsumaki, wasn't necessarily born with the strongest quirk right off the bat. No, Izuku had to go through grueling training with his sister in order to develop his quirk. Tatsumaki struggled with control when it came on to her quirk, while Izuku he struggled with the power output. Basically, Izuku had to train to make his quirk stronger, while Tatsumaki had to train to get a hang of her quirk, make sure that she didn't destroy anything that was in her line of vision. That was the things that Tatsumaki had to suffer with when she was younger. Of course, she would have been bullied a little bit as well, which ended up forming her mentality. So that's why she ended up being so much of an overprotective sister towards Izuku. Although, when it came on to Izuku, eventually he would start to try and grow out of his sister's shadow, try and make her understand that he didn't necessarily need her protection as much anymore. He would grow to be a bit on the cocky side, but not necessarily to the same extent as Tatsumaki. Izuku would always be struggling with his sister's shadow. I've mentioned this before, but many people would always compare Izuku to Tatsumaki, considering how powerful Tatsumaki was, and well, Izuku, although he was powerful in his own right, Tatsumaki was just stronger. It's just clear as day, that's basically how it really went. Izuku was the second strongest, and Fubuki would always be the weakest out of the trio. But when it came on to when Fubuki was actually brought into the picture, Izuku especially did his best to not just be seen as one of the Esper siblings. He wanted to form his own identity, make a name for himself. So he would start focusing on different sort of things, you could say, when it came on to the telekinetic aspects of his quirk. Once Izuku first saw All Might save 100 people from a burning building, he was immediately awe-inspired by the man. He wanted to be just like All Might, being able to save so many people all at once. So Izuku would have began to focus more on his physical body rather than trying to focus on range and all of that, sort of like how Tatsumaki is. Tatsumaki didn't necessarily focus on her physical body, but more so just the strength of her quirk itself. She wouldn't have really thought about using her psychokinesis to increase her body's strength, speed, and durability. No, she would just focus on making barriers and all of that. Large barriers of the sorts. Controlling the winds, all of those sort of things. And she would have even shown this off to Izuku, saying that if he was really going to stay committed to just focusing his quirk around his body, he would be missing out on all of these different sort of opportunities, such as being able to manipulate the wind, create these large barriers, be able to throw projectiles, turn anything into a weapon if you throw it fast enough with your telekinesis abilities. And Izuku would have thought about this for a while and realized that, yeah, she was right. So he decided to, focus primarily on tactile telekinesis, but he would also focus on including range here. He would try and increase his range still, but at the same time always be much more comfortable with just using tactile telekinesis, keep everything relatively close to him, increase his body strength, speed, durability, just so that he would be able to stand out from his sister in that aspect. This would actually even affect his physique over the years as well. While Izuku was focusing on making his body stronger, he would have ended up actually developing his body to look more along the lines of Bruce Lee, you could say. Basically, Izuku would have had a physique similar to Bruce Lee. He would have been muscular, but not too ripped or anything, not too insanely shredded. He was strong and all of that. He had muscle to his body, but not an extreme amount of it. But this muscle that he did have on his body, it was basically not just for show, if you get what I mean. When he was younger, he would have been bullied from time to time, but that was mainly because of the fact that his quirk was relatively weak at the time, especially when it had just awakened. So he would have tried even more to really try and train his quirk. That was one of the main things pushing him, one of his main drives to really master his quirk. Tatsumaki would not have been around during these times when he was getting bullied though. It was always during the times when she was not around that Izuku would have been bullied. But when it came on to Izuku, he was much more confident in this timeline, and especially when he was being trained by his older sister. When Fubuki came into the picture, she was also relatively strong in her own right. She was far stronger actually than Izuku when he had just unlocked his quirk. She did not necessarily have to really worry about the bullies as much. She would end up looking up more towards Tatsumaki, not really focusing on her physical body as much, but the absolute strength of her Asper abilities. She would have just taken more after her older sister, and Tatsumaki would more often over the years be more protective of Fubuki rather than Izuku. She would have started to understand that Izuku was trying to develop his own identity, and he was also showing that he was quite strong as well. He was continuously proving that he was growing stronger and stronger every day. She realized that she could not afford to hold him back by trying to be the overprotective sister, but when it came on to Fubuki, she was just too much. She was just too similar to her sister in the way that she used her quirk, which was why she ended up becoming a helicopter sister of the sorts. She didn't necessarily do this on purpose or anything, but she just deeply cared for her family members. Izuku would have tried mentioning this to Tatsumaki at times, and she would relent at sometimes. Other times, she would have become even more overbearing towards Fubuki though. But while this was going on, Izuku would just continue to develop on his own. 10 years would have passed since then, since he had first awakened his quirk, and he would have just been reflecting on his journey up until now. He would have just been reflecting while the teacher was mentioning how everyone in the class wanted to be heroes. Everyone would just start cheering and begin using their quirks. But that was not necessarily the case for Izuku and Bakugo. Izuku was just too caught up in his own world to really honestly care about what was happening. When the teacher mentioned how 2 students wanted to join UA, how they had actually applied for UA, the class already know who they were. They just turned around to look at Izuku and Bakugo. Izuku and Bakugo, well, they weren't necessarily on the best of terms here, but not the worst of terms either. Bakugo respected Izuku's strength, but that didn't necessarily mean they had to be friends. No, they were at best rivals. They were nowhere near close to being friends. The two just existed here with a little bit of that rivalry next to it. Bakugo found that Izuku's barriers could be broken through enough force being used, which was why he was focusing so much on increasing the strength of his explosions. That and the variety of his explosions as well, but at the same time, he would have just continued to try and see how big he could make his explosions, how powerful, how much he could burn, all of those things. That's pretty much what Bakugo would have been focusing on. Hand-to-hand combat, Bakugo held the advantage in speed, while Izuku had more strength in his punches, thanks to that tactile telekinesis moves he had. While Bakugo did use explosions during these hand-to-hand combat simulations, or basically just sparring. That's what I'm trying to say. Basically, during the sparring sessions, Bakugo wouldn't rarely ever be able to break through Izuku's aura, that sort of skin tight barrier he had. It's honestly quite hard to get through it. That's pretty much like the strongest sort of barrier Izuku has. Izuku made sure that every single time he would have that barrier up and about every single day, 24/7, which would have always strengthened his Esper abilities, and he would also try and make weaker barriers to cover up from there on. Continue making weaker barriers, just stack them on top of each other, which they would always be weaker each time, but they weren't necessarily too weak to where they could just be broken through easily. He would have made sure that they would have been relatively strong. He would have made sure that they were strong enough to handle damage from other people. Honestly, that's pretty much it when it came on to Izuku. Izuku was just that sort of way. He was cocky, and Bakugo just didn't really care for the kid besides fighting him from time to time because he was the only one who actually gave him a challenge, really was the one to force him to constantly improve. Bakugo didn't bother standing up here, and he would just let the class talk. Izuku would just be on his way home after school, but he would end up encountering the sludge villain. The sludge villain would of course say the same thing, talking about how All Might was here, that monster was here. And Izuku was confused. Who was this guy talking about? Then they mentioned wanting to take over Izuku's body. He does not do that. He does not mess with that sort of stuff, so he would just, simply compress the sludge villain into a ball quite easily, honestly. All Might would come a little later, and Izuku would just hand the villain over to the hero. Izuku would have explained the situation to All Might, and All Might would just nod his head, accepting the reason. He was not going to arrest Izuku for using his quirk, since it was, an act of self-defense. Izuku would hand over the villain, and All Might would just pull out a bottle to contain the villain within. All Might would just leave Izuku, and Izuku would just go back home. He would do 10 months of training for UA, and by the time those 10 months were over, the entrance exam would have been happening. Izuku, after those 10 months, he already felt like he had it in the bag, to be honest. The written exam was pretty easy, pretty simple, and the physical portion was all that he really had to be concerned about. He really didn't even have to worry about that part though, because he would just simply punch through most of the robots. He would rip some of their parts off as well to use them as projectiles. He would have simply lifted up the robots though and crushed them. If that weren't, he would have done that instead if it weren't for the fact that doing such a move would be quite taxing to do repeatedly in the span of a couple of minutes. It also took too long in comparison of what he's doing right now. He was easily cutting through about 3 or 4 robots at a time now. Here, instead, he would have had to basically focus on one robot if he was trying to do that crushing move. Try and lift up one robot at a time, crush them, go to another robot, do the same thing. Yeah, absolutely not. That's way too troublesome. That's way too much of a burden for Izuku. Plus, these guys were heavy as well. Yeah, he can lift up quite a bit, but even he has his limits when it comes on to how much he can lift at a time. Even though he built up his strength levels throughout those 10 months, he did not want to really try and test his luck against these guys by trying to lift them up. He would just end up getting around 70 points here, and he would begin to head out with the rest of the students, the UA candidates, until he heard a plea for help by a girl with brown hair. He would have seen her in the rubble, and he would have completely turned back around and simply just lift the rubble off of her using the telekinesis. He was not about to actually fight the robot. No, it would be much easier to just grab the girl and run. So he would use his telekinesis to also lift up the girl, bring her over to his side, and he already knew that there's no way he was about to crush the 0-point robot. He knew he was strong, but he knew his limits. He was smart. He was not dumb. He would have passed the entrance exam with an extra 15 points, putting him in first place. he would have had that extra 15 points being rescue points for saving Ochako. He was only 5 points shy though of tying with his oldest sister's score, which he would just click his tongue in slight disappointment. He was 5 points off from actually beating his sister. Not beating, but well, tying with his sister's score. So he decided to, you know what, just train a little more. That's pretty much what his solution would have been to the problem. The first day at UA as an actual student, Izuku would just hit Bakugo and Ida with a telepathic order to just shut up after he finally found Class 1A, and all he could hear was a bunch of yelling coming from the two. He was just so annoyed right now. It was too early for this stuff. The two would just look over to Izuku and see his annoyed face. They already knew that they messed up, so they would just be silent. Bakugo would tusk and remove his feet from the top of his desk. Ida would go over to sit in his own seat as well. He had already seen what Izuku was capable of doing in the entrance exam, and so he really did not want any smoke with Izuku right now. Ochako would come over and thank Izuku for saving her during the entrance exams, to which he would just simply say, no need to thank him, he was just doing what any decent person would have probably done if they were in his position and capable of doing it. Aizawa would walk into the room not too long after and explain what they would be doing once they were outside, dressed in their PE uniforms. Izuku would have been the first one to actually throw the ball and get a pretty remarkable score. He had 1.5 kilometers. Everyone would have been quite impressed by Izuku's score, and next thing you know, they would just start praising him until some pink-haired, pink-skinned girl mentioned how this seemed to be quite fun. Aizawa would have been irked hearing that and immediately started to mention how the student who ended up scoring last place here would be deemed as having no potential and be kicked out of UA. Absolutely no rebuttal here, because he would have mentioned this as well. If you try and argue with me, you will also be expelled. Izuku, he would make sure to do his best, even though he felt like he was probably one of the better students here within Class 1A. He did not know what sort of competition he still had here. He was going to make sure that he stayed within the top levels of Class 1A though. So Izuku would go through most of the tests, dominating the competition, except for the race, you know, the 50 meter dash. Ida would have still won that, being just a couple seconds faster than Izuku. And when it came on to the side jump portion, well, Manetta would have just won by luck. Ida had faster travel speed, and Manetta was just lucky. That's pretty much how it went for those two events. Izuku would have still ended up winning first place though, and Manetta would have been expelled. Oh yeah, also when it came on to the, what do you call it again? The ball throw, yeah, Ochako wouldn't have ended up getting first place in that, considering that, well, it's hard beating Infinity. Izuku wouldn't have even really considered that though, because of the way her quirk was, the nature of Uraraka's quirk, which she would have ended up finding out during the other parts of the exam. Being some sort of, it was basically some sort of thing dealing with gravity. Over when you saw the ball throw, he had immediately realized right then and there that her quirk basically deals with lowering the gravity of things, the zero gravity or something. And yeah, Izuku just ended up winning first place. Besides those three events, Izuku was just able to dominate the competition that badly in order for him to have actually made it into first place. And Manetta would have been expelled from UA. The battle training arc would be an interesting story though. A very interesting and different story, but that would be for another day. Remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe. King Tynex out.